For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi. And on the Books Corner today, we're talking to the author, Anirudh Suri, of the book, The Great Tech Game, Shaping Geopolitics and the Destinies of Nations. Anirudh, great to have you here. Welcome to StratNews Global.
No, thank you very much, Amitabh. Pleasure to be here.
I mean, the amount of research that's gone into this book, hats off. I've gone as far as I am, haven't had guts to do a PhD, and it's disciplinary. We're looking at history, what lessons we can learn from that. You're also using your various lenses of your own experience, whether it's in government, whether it's in policy. So tell us a little bit about the book for those who haven't read it as yet, and hopefully lots more will read it after this interview.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Amitabh. See, the book is actually intended to be that big picture view, and as a result, it has to be interdisciplinary because big picture view of how technology is shaping the destinies of nations, and of course, us as individuals and societies as well. And I think that having worked in the tech industry, the tech venture capital and startup world for the last decade, and as you mentioned, prior to that, I used to be in government, management consulting, think tanks, etc. My own particular view or worldview is that technology is shaping so much in our lives that unless we get that big picture right, we'll remain too much in the weeds and miss that, bigger story that I think we all need to be familiar with, right? About how tech is shaping the geopolitics of our world, the world order, how it's shaping new friendships and alliances on the world stage, why some of those alliances are happening. That's on the geopolitical side, but equally important is how it's shaping the economic competitiveness of nations, right? And to me, that's a completely different lens. You really have to understand the digital economy and how tech is shaping multiple sectors. It's not just a sector. And finally, I think the most important piece that came out of my research that you very kindly referred to was that actually the societal impact, the impact of tech on society, how our societies are structured, how we live, where we live, our values, our behaviors, our relationships, how tech is shaping that, I think is equally important to be studied and understood from a historical as well as big picture perspective. Otherwise, I think we, will miss the boat, so to say.
Let's jump straight to the last chapter when you talk about the game plan for India.
Yeah.
And when you talk about history, you've gone into agricultural societies, trade, colonization, industrialization. This is the latest great game. So each before that also had elements of technology involved in it. How does India, in your own words, not be a laggard or a loser, but a winner in this game?
Correct. And I think that's probably the most important question that I've also posed in the book is, from an Indian standpoint, we've lost some of these earlier great games. Right, as you rightly mentioned, I think maybe in the agri game we were a winner, one of the winners. But subsequently, whether it's been global trade, whether it's been industrialization, or even capitalism, we've usually been, I would say, losers / laggards / not winners. And so it's that much more important that this time we get the game. So how is the question? And I think that the first piece of it is to understand the game. Right. The first, I think, basic element is to understand the key elements of this game, the key rules of this game, and the key capabilities you need to build as a nation. Right? And I think what I have tried to do is, one, the book tries to explain what the game is about. But I think to answer your question specifically, I think India needs to keep track of 5 things. One is, and I'll list them out, in fact. One is talent. Second is capital. Third is technology. Fourth is policy. And fifth, which is probably the most important in my mind, is strategy. Right? So why I say these 5 things, I think that talent ultimately will drive how we leverage tech, right, and innovation for our own benefits, right? And of course, also economically benefit as employees of companies, managers, etc. Capital, because as you've seen, I'm in the world of venture capital as well, ultimately capital is required for innovations to scale today, right? Tech, and we have a lot of talent and capital, by the way, in India now to compete in the great tech game. I think where we are lacking is the other 3 things. right? So on the tech piece, for example, it's very important for us to understand that just having unicorns is not enough. Because as I've now mentioned multiple times in conversations with friends and others, the total combined bank balances of the 100 or so unicorns we have today,
not even equal to one.
Total, correct, will not add up to even one of the big tech firms in the US or elsewhere. And unless we realize that we have to own the core technology, and we must have companies that build moats around that technology, then build up wealth, and then use that wealth to further fund innovation in the country, I think we'll lose out on that big element of what is required to win. And then there's policy. I think policy, there's been a lot of talk about how tech policy needs to really be in line with today's world and not be stuck in the industrial era, right? So the rules cannot be built in a way that are aligned to the industrial era kind of thinking, but must be aligned to the tech game kind of thinking. So policy must adapt. And finally, the strategy piece, right? As a country, we must understand that we have to have a clear role in the global tech ecosystem. What is that role? Do we want to just be a services nation? Is that enough? Do we want to just be a talent nation? Do we want to just be a consumer market? Right? Even in the British era, we were a consumer market. That didn't do wonders for us, right? So today we must have a strategy of where we want India to be in this global tech ecosystem, and what should our own strategy be to make sure we are in the top 3 to 5 nations, for example, in that pecking order.
Now, when you look at that, do you pick certain areas where you already have strengths, or you build up on those strengths? I mean, when you look at, say, UPI, the digital governance, Aadhaar, COVIN, I know for a fact, say, countries like the Philippines, there is a lot of, at least talk so far,
That's right.
that they're trying to ASEAN, South Asia, Asia, Africa, Latin America, these models. And it's not, as I've heard you speak before, it's not just, you talk about a base being built and then other people utilizing that base to monetize it, right? Could explain that thought of?
Yes, so as I see it, I think that India is building the digital public infrastructure that India is building, right, in the form of UPI, Aadhaar. Now there's talk of, obviously, even in the healthcare and agri and education sectors, to build somewhat similar kind of infrastructure as the UPI has done for the fintech world. And I think that ultimately we must not think of it as simply a infrastructure piece. Right? Today, the thinking is that that's an infrastructure layer we've built, and then the rest we'll see where it goes. My belief is that we must have a strategy for where that goes. And what I say in the book is that, in a way, the analogy I draw is that Apple built out its iOS, the operating system. Google built out Android, in fact, bought it, right? But then the monetization of it happened via the suite of apps that were built on top, right? So their goal was not to just sort of export the operating system, right? So our goal similarly must not be only to export the operating system, which is, let's say, UPI, Aadhaar, etc. Our goal actually should be to ensure, and this is where the private sector will really come in and the startup ecosystem will play a big role, is build that marketplace of apps on top, whether in fintech, whether in healthcare, whether in education. And these apps, in my mind, should be the ones that go out to the Philippines of the world, to the Indonesias of the world, to the Kenyas of the world, and in fact to Europe, North America, Latin America, and elsewhere, right? Even developed nations, not just developing countries, I think in Southeast Asia and Africa. And I think those will be the economic ambassadors of, I think, the Indian tech story, rather than just the UPI layer.
You dwell on earlier great games, say, for example, Telegram or Telegraph, and how the UK tries to keep the US, which is a rising power at that point, out of that technology. The infrastructure for digital communication and technology, which is the undersea cables.
Correct.
We talk about that as well, how India should be part of the game, right?
That's right.
Because they can be disrupted at any point.
Absolutely. I think there are 3 key elements there. There's the undersea cables, which are linking, different continents today, much like the telegraph did back in the day of 100, 150 years ago. There's the data centers. And then there are what are now called these nodes, right? Which are like almost the last mile centers for this data connectivity. And I think India, unfortunately, is not in the game of the undersea cables piece at all. And that's, from a geopolitical standpoint, a big concern, because, as I mentioned in the book, the UK, Britain used that control of the telegraph infrastructure to hurt Germany when it came to World War I, even in World War II. And I think in the case of conflict in the coming years, and we're seeing a lot more geopolitical conflict now in any case, right? I think that risk is real. Now, there are only a few companies that manage, set up, repair these undersea cables. So India must have close partnerships with these companies, and of course also hopefully build and encourage some Indian companies to have the capabilities to bring these cables back, right, in case they are disrupted, right? And also have multiple such cables linking India to the rest of the world so that even if a couple of cables get disrupted, there are others, right? What is called redundancy in the tech world. We must have a strategy to make sure that this kind of connectivity disruption tomorrow does not hurt us in case of geopolitical conflict. That's one. And similarly, I think from a more positive standpoint, India must be building greater connectivity with Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East in terms of setting up these cables so that Indian companies that are looking to, let's say, take UPI-based apps to these nations that we were just referring to, they have a much better infrastructure that they can then leverage to make sure that the speed, the reliability of their services is better. Right? Today, most of these cables are owned by the big tech firms or other companies outside, right? And the priority on these cables is also given to companies or tech companies from those areas. So I think even from a positive economic standpoint, we must be setting up these cables. They're like railway or airline connectivity, right? Today. As important as that is today, the data connectivity is also equally, if not more important.
One equivalence that I see between, say, terrorism and technology is the area of deniability.
That's right.
India's capabilities should be not just in defense, but do you think they should be in offensive capabilities as well, if need be?
Has to be, right? It's. I think the analogy is pretty good that you can't just be playing a defensive game, right? Even in the case of terrorism, I think different governments have had different philosophies, but I think that ultimately most people do realize that you have to have that offensive capability as a deterrence as well. If you don't have that offensive capability, then of course the deterrence doesn't work either. So I think in the case of the US, even with Russia, one of the things that President Biden has often emphasized is that they have that offensive capability as a way to deter others from attacking or conducting cyber attacks against the US. And I think India must similarly have a very credible offensive capability, right, to deter such attacks. And then, of course, I think defense has to be equally strong. And ultimately, because of the deniability and the nature of cyber attacks, I think, Amitabh, it's very important for the world to, at some point in the cyber world as well, much like in the nuclear world, to achieve some sort of equilibrium so that cyber attacks just don't become, the next sort of like suicide attack type things where anyone could do it anywhere, right, and disrupt lives and economic activity. There has to be a balance between that offense and defense globally, right? Not just for India, but globally. Otherwise, we'll end up seeing so much more in terms of cyber attacks. And now I think, as you also know, the critical infrastructure, especially with 5G and other technologies coming in that will connect our industries, our power grids, our railways, our airlines, everything to tech, finance, even UPI and Aadhaar, unless we have the defensive capability as well to defend these, what I call the digital borders, right? Not just the physical borders, we want to defend our digital borders. I think we'll be in deep trouble.
Talking about borders, there was a lot of talk before the Russian invasion of Ukraine of how warfare has changed to be completely technology dominated. The humans may not be involved in the actual fighting.
Yeah.
But we've seen how conventional war is still taking place. How do you see warfare evolving, if I can use that word, with technology?
Yes, see, I mean, what I've argued in the book is that we are now clearly in a hybrid war doctrine era, right? Where it's no longer just about one or the other.
Yeah.
I don't believe that we will not have wars with tanks or humans, but I also don't believe that it'll just be that, right? I think it'll be a combination. It's not an either or scenario. And I think the case of Ukraine and Russia, I think a lot of people said, oh, well, listen, we've gone back to World War II type tanks. And I actually don't see it like that. I see that actually the choice of what Russia used, right, the strategy they used was what was least expected. And that's the right strategy in a way from a country standpoint. When people were expecting cyber, they conducted physical, right? That doesn't mean they will not use cyber or other countries will not use cyber when it comes to it. Second, if you look at the response of the West has been very much tech-driven. right? They came in with their cyber defense teams. They came in with, excluding Russia from the global SWIFT platforms. All the big tech firms of the US withdrew from Russia. So if you look at the response, which is as much of a part of that conflict, the response was very much a tech-driven response. And I think so. My view is that the future of war will be hybrid. Now, this is another domain or another dimension that's gotten added, and countries will choose the domain
spectrum they use.
That's right.
And again, when you're talking about technology, SWIFT, the financial sanctions that the US-led West imposed on Russia, there was already a move, say, from President Putin from Russia and from the Chinese to develop systems to bypass that or the alternatives to the Western financial.
That's right.
How do you see that developing? Is there going to be an A and B that everybody else chooses, or can India contribute to a C?
I think that splintering, or what's called the Splinternet, I think that splintering is now much more likely. Right? If you look at the last 10 years, in fact, and I've covered this in the book as well, if you look at the last 10, 15 years, in any case, the world has been moving to that, but there was a hesitation, or there was an optimism that somehow we could prevent this kind of splintering or a Cold War-esque type split of the internet and of the tech world. My worry now is that given what has happened now in the last few months, the Russians and the Chinese and other friends of Russia and China will be very clear that technology has gotten very clearly weaponized. And when it comes to it, the US and Europe will use and leverage their strengths in this field to cut off, right? And hence it's almost inevitable now to me that they will build out their alternative financial settlement system. They will build out their own national internet that cannot be cut off by foreign powers. They will build out their own internet infrastructure, right? And their internet cables in a way they control, right? And they have learned, if you look at how the Chinese have also acted, the Chinese have learned a lot of the lessons that I've mentioned in the book. They have seen history and how the US was denied by the UK, how the UK used it against Germany, right? This internet infrastructure control. And I think they've been very clear for the last 10 years. It's obvious that Huawei, we talk about 5G, but Huawei has also been building out the marine networks, right? So they have learned the lessons. I think other countries need to learn too. Now, the question is, if this splintering does happen, what are the costs we will bear? I think, and whether India has a option 3 to offer, I'm not so sure. I think because we are not in control of the internet infrastructure, the internet standards, and I've written a lot about this. We have actually not been playing that game at all. We've definitely been doing well on the startup ecosystem side, for sure. But we've not been in control of the tech governance piece. In fact, India is nowhere, if you look at tech governance institutions, the ITUs and the ICANNs of the world, India is not present there. And I say that, unless we make sure that we are present there and are actively participating in that, I think the splintering will happen. And I think in a way, countries other than the China and the US have to step in and say that from an economic standpoint, it's very important that the world has a global internet. Because otherwise tomorrow the Indian IT companies will also have to build, and the Indian startups will have to build 2 different products and 2 different set of standards they will have to use to build their products for let's say Russia and China and anyone else who's going that way, and for the US and Europe and anyone else who's going that way. And a third set of countries that might say we want to kind of remain online. And that will, of course, add and impose a lot of economic costs and close off markets. And that's not good from an economic standpoint. So it's almost up to everyone else to say that, listen, we don't want this kind of splitting to happen. But I think right now I don't see it.
And like you're pointing out, standards that are being set, whether it's for telecommunication, for 5G, ITU, very important to be on the table there while the rules are being set.
That's right. Very
shaping those rules.
That's right. Very important to be there, because the analogy I again draw in conversations is, we look back at the UN and say, hey, listen, India should have had a seat at the table. And 70 years hence, we're still fighting for that seat at the table, right? And a lot of people say, oh, we had a chance to get a seat at the table then, we gave it up, in favor of our neighbor. We shouldn't make that same mistake today. We shouldn't wait to get a table like 20 years from now. Today is the time for us to make sure that as a tech nation, as one of the largest tech markets, as one of the largest tech ecosystems, as an IT nation, we must be sitting there and helping set the standards, set the rules of the game.
And in terms of your book, again, outlines different possible scenarios or strategies that different countries can pursue or are in the process of doing that. Where do you see India now, and where should we actually be going to be among the top three, if not higher?
Correct. So I think that India has a lot of its pieces in place. I think we just need to have a overarching comprehensive strategy so that we are clear of where we want to get to. Right? As I mentioned, we have the talent, we have the capital, we have the startup ecosystem, so on and so forth. We are a very attractive investment destination as well today from a tech standpoint, right? But I think that economically, we are still not clear on how we become a tech nation. Right? We are seeing this, for example, in the semiconductor push that the government has recently launched, which is commendable, but it's come 20, 30 years too late. Right? So one of the things I argue is that we must be early in whatever waves of tech innovation we are seeing and not be latecomers to the game. Because then you don't get to be the winners usually. There's no doubt that latecomers can also come and get ahead in the game, no doubt. East Asian nations are a very clear example of how they've caught up, but they're still not the US or Europe, right? So the early winners in any tech wave do have an edge, in my view. And so to me, while we must catch up on the semiconductor wave, we must catch up on the internet, B2C consumer app wave, which our startup ecosystem is doing, we must also have an eye on the future waves. And I mentioned a couple in the book, as I'm seeing it from my standpoint. ClimateTech, for example, and BioTech are two clear examples of subsequent waves of tech innovation that we must be early players in now, right? If you look at ClimateTech for a second, China and Europe, I would say, and the US are already on that bandwagon. We are not. We are still in India seeing climate as a crisis, as a challenge only. And my view is that we must see it as an economic opportunity. We must see that climate tech will transform the entire industrial sector, the entire agriculture sector, entire mobility, entire, even ships and transport, everything really, right? The whole economic frame of the global economy will have to evolve if we are to survive. And hence, to me, that's an opportunity. And so it's very important that we have the right policy in place for that, the right tech in place for that, the right talent for climate tech to be put in place, the right strategy. Right? So India must not be only catching up. We must, in addition to catching up, must also have an eye on the future. I think that's very, very important.
And how positive are you that we do have an eye on the future?
I don't think we have an eye on the future, to be
honest.
Of now. We don't. We have an eye on catching up. And I think we're doing a decent job at catching up on the existing game of the internet and tech ecosystem, right? So semiconductor policy push is good. I think our services push is very good. Our startup push is very good. Our GovTech or our digital public infrastructure, probably one of the best in the world today. But I think, do we have an eye on climate tech? No, we don't. Do we have an eye on biotech? No. While I think there are parts of the Indian government like BioTech, etc., there are departments that are doing very interesting work. But I think, do we have a clear view of what the bioeconomy or the climate economy looks like in India 5-10 years from now? No, we don't. Right? We are still concerned that the US and the West must give us finance to deal with the climate challenge. And I think that's a fair argument to make on the global stage. And they must, given they've been the main contributors to the climate problem historically. But from an economic opportunity standpoint, I think India is not yet has its eye on that ball. I think, and we must do that sooner than later.
I know you're still savoring this book. It's just come out, but your plans for the future?
I'm not so sure. I think there's still a lot, even within this book, that even I have to unpack. And, as I've mentioned, the book, to me, one of the reasons I've written this book is I've shared my perspective, but really that big picture is not something that can come out of one person or one organization, right? It has to be a much broader, inclusive conversation, right? So my goal is to, in a way, like spark those conversations and, lots of pieces that lend themselves to lots of deeper conversations. But I think that a couple of interesting pieces that have come up in conversations like ours today is the climate tech piece and the digital public infrastructure piece. I think those two pieces are very interesting threads that need to be, I think, unpacked much more, whether in the form of a book or not. I'm not sure. But definitely in the form of much more conversations and writings and discussions, I think.
And it's an absolute pleasure talking to you about this book and various issues that you're bringing up. Thank you for giving us so much time.
No, thank you, Amit. That was a pleasure.
And you can unpack this book here. Go get it online. Send us your feedback about Anirudh's interview and the issues that he's brought up and any other issues. You can also follow us on social media. To help support our platform as well, you can do that directly with the link that's provided in YouTube, or YouTube has a new feature which is called Super Thanks. That'll appear as soon as this stream ends. You've been watching Books Corner with Anirudh Suri on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh.